Well, hello there, everyone, and welcome back once again. Now that we have looked at sort of the outcome of that debate over industrial America versus sort of rural America, now we want to talk about, and we are kind of taking a step back here. So again, we're not really going in chronological order. What we want to look now is what was going on when it came to the interests of industry and business and all of that. Because while the West was opening up and the West was becoming, this great place of massive, large scale agriculture, commercialized agriculture. At the same time, the eastern portion of the United States and parts of even Midwest places like Chicago and so forth were becoming further and further urbanized and industrialized. And what we were seeing is a new industrial age, and the United States becoming a leading world power. Now, in 10th grade, we learned about the Industrial Revolution itself. We talked about how the Industrial Revolution came to the United States, how it slowly developed in the United States, and how the United States began manufacturing a lot of its own products. But what we're looking at here is what we call kind of a second wave of industrialization, a second wave of industry in which the United States is not going to become not just one of many countries that is industrialized and that produces manufactured goods that might be distributed in other parts of the world, but the United States becoming the leading industrial power by 1900, surpassing even Great Britain, of course, which was where the Industrial Revolution had even began. And the United States not being, a bunch of small manufacturers and small factories, hundreds of businesses here and there, but large, what we might call today major corporations that are, international in their distribution and those kinds of things, like I said, becoming a leading world power. And the United States was well suited for that, both in natural ways and also just because of the climate of the time. The United States is a vast area with a lot of different kinds of resources, very rich in natural resources. The West plays a big part in this. It's interesting that while the West and agriculture and industry seem to be competing with each other, they also go hand in hand, because the West provides a lot of those natural resources that were necessary for industrialization to take place. And industrialization is making it possible for people in the West to get the manufactured goods they need, the railroad transportation that they need. So it's all kind of a cycle, and they need each other, although they are also competing with each other. The vast increase and advancements in transportation with the railroads, which is where we're going to start, encourage this massive wave of industrial development, new technology, new business practices that make things more efficient, that are not necessarily best for everyone, but that certainly make things more productive, less expensive to produce, easier to mass produce, and a government that, as we've already mentioned a few times, a government that did not really believe, and a population that largely did not believe, that there ought to be a whole lot of government regulation, that the government should sort of make it easier for businesses by not having a lot of restrictions on them, by passing tariffs that would make it easier for them to get into the market, by not taxing them all that much. And also some, good old-fashioned ingenuity and entrepreneurship and good ideas and good business managers, all those things leading the United States from going from sort of being a minor industrial producer to the major industrial power of the world. So we're going to start by talking about the first major business that started to head that direction, the first real big business in the United States, and that was the railroads. Now, we know that railroads had been around ever since about the 1840s. You saw an increase in railroad building during the Civil War. And it's interesting and kind of ironic, really. We've already said that this was a time in which the government, or most people in power and most just regular folks, believed that the government should not interfere with business, that the government shouldn't pass a lot of restrictions and regulations. It's what we call laissez-faire. You may have heard laissez-faire. That's a French phrase that means let it be. That was a very Jeffersonian concept, that the government really should not have a role in the economy. It should be hands-off. Let it be. Just let it do what it's going to do and let things develop on their own. It's true that they did believe that, but it is also ironic that, in a way, they kind of don't act on that 100% because it is through government encouragement. It is through government intervention, not restriction, but government intervention in the way of encouragement that allows businesses to grow like this, particularly with the railroads. Railroad building takes off, starting during the Civil War years, and then certainly after the Civil War years. There is a massive expansion in railroad building. There is a massive number of railroads that are built and areas that are connected by rail. And a lot of it was due to government intervention. And it's without government assistance, that wouldn't have happened. The government encouraged railroads not by, telling railroad companies to go build, but they did make it easy for them, and they did incentivize them. They gave them very generous loans, for example, that they could then use to build these railroads. Huge land grants. That's a big thing, is they would give them land grants in the Western territories, Western areas, and either the railroad companies would build on that land, and they could also sell that land off. And when they sold it, that would give them money to finance the railroad building. So this did lead to a huge amount of railroad construction. We talked about that in the Civil War chapter, including the beginning of transcontinental railroad building. Remember, the Transcontinental Railroad was the first railroad to go all the way from East Coast to West Coast, to connect the eastern portion of the United States with the western portion of the United States. That was talked about for a long time. During the Civil War, they started building it, and that project was completed in 1869. That's the picture that you see here. This is the company that built the railroad from one end, meeting the company that built it from the other end, and they met in the middle. And that was your first time that the West Coast and the East Coast were fused together. And that was a huge feat, not just a technological feat, but that really opens up the West. It really makes the West truly connected with the rest of the country and really firmly added, to the Union. And then railroad construction just booms from there. Multiple transcontinental railroads will be built over the next couple of decades. And by 1900, there were probably at least 5 or 6 transcontinental railroads going from East Coast to West Coast. So it's a massive increase. Some of this, as I said, is due to, government intervention and government assistance, loans, land grants, easy policies, and not a whole lot of restriction. But some of it is also through individual people and their initiative and their ingenuity. One important individual when it comes to railroad building who became kind of the king of the railroad industry is Cornelius Vanderbilt. Some of you may recognize the name Vanderbilt, most likely from Vanderbilt University, which is named after him, because he becomes incredibly wealthy off of the railroad industry. And, Vanderbilt University is, started from a endowment by him. Cornelius Vanderbilt was a railroad tycoon that, was just a good businessman. He's not like an engineer to build railroads, but a good businessman who invested his company in building more railroads and in utilizing and popularizing a lot of railroad technologies, like using steel. That's a big thing that changes the railroad industry, is using steel instead of iron, because steel was a lot stronger. It was fast. It could be, they were more usable. The trains could maybe even go faster because the steel could bear a heavier load. Things like using the standard gauge, the amount of space between the two ties, so that it's all standardized and you don't have trains that can run on these tracks but not on these tracks because the distance was different, the gauge was different. So he expanded many, many railroad lines and amassed a great fortune doing that. And we're going to see people in a variety of industries do that, amass, huge amounts of wealth, which is why we see their names on universities and libraries and things like that, because they use their money also to build a lot of public things. So Cornelius Vanderbilt becomes an extremely powerful and extremely wealthy individual. This map should just give you a bit of an idea of the railroad expansion that's taking place in this period. If you notice the green lines, this represents major railroad lines in 1870, roughly about 5 years at the end of the Civil War. You'll notice that there's lots of them, but they are primarily on the East Coast and around the Chicago area. All of this, you don't see very many going out west. This one would be your first transcontinental railroad that was completed in 1869. But look what happens between 1870 and 1890. Look at the amount that you see in the red here, and notice how many are connecting the West, that are going to these Western states. So no longer are those areas just, out in the nothingness. They are now connected, and that means more settlement. That means more trade. That means more commerce between the East and the West. And we've already talked about the West and how that was being opened up because of the railroads. So nothing does more to open up Western settlement, to open up the West and its vast resources than the railroad. So let's talk about and kind of put more of a fine point on the effects of this railroad boom. Well, as I've already said, of course, that increases trade. It increases commerce. It opens up all these new markets for industrial goods. So all of those factories in the East have a way to get those goods out to those Western territories and Western states where people are settling and where people want to buy those products. So it's just more places for those goods to be sold. It increases the demand for other products, for other industries, and it's going to lead to the growth of some of the other big industries that we're going to talk about in a few minutes, namely steel. Steel is going to become one of the largest industries in the United States. The United States is going to become the leading steel producer in the world because of the railroads, is where that all gets started. Other things, rubber and eventually oil, stuff like that, is coal, all of those industries are going to increase as well because of the railroads. The railroads become, we're moving into this age of big business, of big, what we might call today like corporations. And the railroads were the first of those, that they kind of paved the way for that. So it begins massive economic growth and economic expansion. It opens up the West more than anything else did. It stimulates all those Western activities like mining and agriculture. It increases urbanization, people moving to the cities, even things like time zones. You may not realize that, but the reason we have time zones, which in our area can drive us nuts sometimes since we're right on the middle between two of them, and half of us are in one and half of us are in the other, that was instituted because of railroads, to help railroads keep their schedules. Before time zones, people relied on the time, based on the position of the sun, which can differ, just a couple of miles away. So time, was a little bit more flexible than it is now. So this was designed to say, okay, if it's 12 o'clock here, then it's 12 o'clock over there, that sort of thing. So even time zones were introduced because of that. And it makes some people like Cornelius Vanderbilt and others insanely rich. We have the beginning of millionaires and even billionaires by this period, which was something that was unheard of prior to that. So the country is definitely changing, making life better for some people, but there's also some wrongdoing here. There's also certainly a downside that we can certainly guess will come from the creation of these large industries, including the railroads. What we also start to get in this period, and it begins with people like Vanderbilt, and this one of the ways he gets so wealthy, it's railroad consolidation. And consolidation, that word just generally means kind of putting something together, taking things, you had a lot of things, you had a lot of variety, and sort of putting what was in a lot of different boxes into one smaller box. Prior to this area, there were hundreds of small railroad companies. But what starts to happen is they start to consolidate, they start to merge together, to where instead of having hundreds of small railroad companies, you really by the 1890s or so, there were maybe 5 or 6 big companies. So they are consolidating into major big companies, or what we might call corporations, although there is a more technical description of that. Well, that can be good. It's more efficient. It can make people a lot more money. It was definitely good for business purposes. It was definitely good for building railroads because you didn't have hundreds of people all trying to do the same thing and competing with each other. But that also leads to some bad things, like a lot of corruption, as you can probably imagine. So there were all kinds of corrupt things going on, both things that were illegal at the time and things that weren't illegal at the time, that were just kind of sneaky and underhanded, but they weren't breaking any laws, at least not yet, stuff that would probably be illegal today, but wasn't back then. There were all kinds of things like kickbacks, when a railroad company gives a contract to a certain group and they're going to get a kickback, some of the money from it. So, sort of like bribery, but bribery was happening. Something called stock watering, which is when railroad companies would really talk up the value of their stock to inflate the price, and then it really wouldn't be worth near as much as what they were saying. And there is just outright bribery, bribing legislatures, bribing state legislatures, Congress, to look the other way when they did bad stuff, to not pass laws to restrict them, to keep the tariffs high, to keep the regulations low, really having the government right there in their pocket. So basically, it's monopolies is what we might be more familiar with calling monopolies. There's several of them, so it's not a total monopoly. But if that helps us understand kind of the concept here of what this turns into, and there's all kind of what we call rate wars. They're like competing with each other. I'm going to set my price here, so their competitor keeps, raising the price higher and higher as they compete with each other. And that just means high prices for a lot of people. So this is why, going back to the populist that we've talked about before, this is why the populist movement was forming. This is why the populists, wanted restrictions on the railroads because of all that stuff that was happening, that the prices were going up and there was all this corruption. They wanted those restrictions. Eventually, by the late 1880s, the government does start to impose some restrictions on the railroads because the populace, the farmers, and it is kind of slow to happen because, again, that belief in limited government. There are plenty of examples where states had tried to pass laws to restrict railroads only to have those laws overturned by the courts to say that the states could not do that. So eventually the federal government does get involved. It becomes apparent that only the federal government is going to be able to restrict the railroads. So the first major piece of legislation to combat these problems in not just the railroads, but really all big businesses with a law called the Interstate Commerce Act, passed in 1887. You may remember that concept of interstate commerce, trade between the states. That's where this comes from, because it was argued that legally only the federal government could regulate these businesses because it's interstate commerce, and so the states don't have control of it. But that's neither here nor there. The Interstate Commerce Act banned certain practices like rebates and kickbacks and that kind of stuff, tried to get rid of some of those things that the railroad companies were doing, but it's not really well enforced. This law and another one we're going to talk about in this chapter are kind of like the two big sort of granddaddies of business regulation, but both of them, they pass them, but they don't really enforce them for a long time. So it's there, and that in and of itself is pretty important, but it's not going to be super enforced for quite a long time. It's interpreted really, really narrowly. It does stop some of the problems, but it won't really fix it completely. It does create something called the Interstate Commerce Commission, which is a group that is tasked with actually enforcing this law and, investigating business transactions, investigating things that railroad companies or whoever were doing. But again, it doesn't really have a lot of teeth to it other than that. So it's going to be a while for this to be very effective, but we will eventually see that happen. So it's sort of like laying the groundwork now for laws that will be better enforced later on. But nevertheless, even though it's not really enforced at this point, it is the first attempt by the federal government to regulate business, to try to put the public interests over the interests of big business. And that is saying something. That's a step in a direction that it's going to take us a while to get into. So the railroads started all. The railroads become the first sort of big business, but we're seeing that happen in lots of different businesses as well. Consolidation and the formation of major big businesses, international, what we would, like I said today, call corporations, but instead of lots of small businesses. We're going to talk about two in particular, but remember that these are kind of the two big ones, but that this was happening in just about any industry and any line of production that you can probably think of. And again, this second wave of industrialization, much bigger than the first, happening because of those natural resources, because of the railroads, because there's a huge amount of labor available in the United States as the population was increasing. Immigration was happening to assist with that. We have all kinds of new technologies, things that you can read about, like Thomas Edison's inventions and the telephone and stuff like that are really making business easier, that are making people's lives easier in a lot of ways, but also new styles of business leadership and business practices and entrepreneurs, people that maybe they weren't the inventors of new products like Thomas Edison and Alexander Graham Bell, but the people that could figure out how to take all those different factors of production and make something new and different with it. And one of the first places that we see that is in the steel industry. And the United States will soon become the biggest steel producer in the world. And the steel industry is revolutionized by this guy who's pictured here, and I bet a lot of you have heard his name. Before I get to him, let me not get ahead of myself. The steel industry takes off partially because of the railroads and partially because of new technology, inventions. Something called the Bessemer process was discovered in Britain, actually. The Bessemer process, I'm not going to go into the technicalities of it, but basically it is a much faster way to make steel, a much more inexpensive way to make steel. And steel was a much more superior metal to iron because it's a lot stronger. Iron is a lot softer, and steel was very strong and lighter, and therefore much better for producing railroads and skyscrapers and whatever else factories you want to build with steel. So that made the steel production hugely successful. And then we have, again, this new class of entrepreneurs, or some people might call them by other names. We'll get to that in a moment. And the guy pictured right here, I bet a lot of you have heard his name. This is Andrew Carnegie. You may have also heard it pronounced Carnegie. I tend to say Carnegie. I'm not sure exactly which one's technically right, but I'll say Carnegie, who becomes the owner of U.S. Steel, which becomes the largest steel producer in the world. And Carnegie started out as a poor immigrant from Scotland, works his way up through the ranks, starts his own steel company, and then begins utilizing a new business process to turn his small little steel company into the steel company, and the largest certainly in the United States and one of the largest in the world. The technique that he used for that, and then he becomes kind of the pioneer of this technique, and then other businesses might use this as well, is something called vertical integration. Vertical integration, vertical means, from top to bottom. It means that he combined all phases of the manufacturing process and put all of that into his company, put all of that into the umbrella, under the umbrella of U.S. Steel. So that means that not only did he have like a steel manufacturing plant, U.S. Steel didn't just own that. U.S. Steel owned the mines where they were, mining the iron ore that they used to make steel. Then they own the refineries. Then they have their own, freight system, their own railroad lines. There are at least, cars and such, own shipping facilities. They have their own warehouses, distribution, even retail. All of that is all under the umbrella of U.S. Steel. And so they basically own all parts of the production, and therefore they'll put everybody else out of business because they're able to do everything in-house, as it were. They don't have to, pay somebody else to mine their stuff. They don't have to pay somebody else to ship it out. They're able to do all of it from top to bottom. And so U.S. Steel becomes, with owning all phases of it, becomes the leading producer of steel. And Carnegie becomes incredibly wealthy, becomes what we call a billionaire, and we'll come back to him in just a moment, and you'll see why you see his name on so many things. The other big example of that, we have Carnegie and the steel industry. The other place we see that really happen, and what some might suggest was a bit more of a nefarious way of doing things, and that's the oil industry. The oil industry, which before this, oil mainly came from the whaling industry, but now we're seeing the refinery, and this is before cars, so we're not to gasoline yet, but kerosene, for kerosene lamps and all that sort of stuff, a market is developing for that. And the wizard that turns the oil industry from nothing into one of the biggest companies on earth was John D. Rockefeller. You may recognize that name, Rockefeller. He's the guy right up there. And he owned Standard Oil, which again went from being a small little oil refinery to one of the largest companies in the world. Rockefeller used a bit of a different strategy to consolidate his company into this massive, giant Standard Oil, which remnants of still exist, called horizontal integration. So Carnegie did it vertically. Rockefeller does it horizontally, basically meaning that he is combining all of his competitors, not the means of production, but all of the other companies, all of his competitors, and integrating them into one company, into Standard Oil, into this giant monster. Now, he would call that, and this is the beginning of what's called a trust. Okay, this is called the trust. So if you want to think of a trust as like a monopoly, a trust is like a combination of business. That's basically what it is. It's a large-scale business combination. But what it is, it's sort of like they're buying out their competitors, or it's more like they're asking, or they make a deal with their competitors to hand over their stock to a board of directors, like, you hand your stock over to the Standard Oil board of directors and it's entrusted to us. We're going to take care of it. So it's kind of like buying them out and creating this massive corporation, this big monopoly. Now, you may be going, I thought all that was illegal. Well, it is now. It is because of these guys and because of the problems that this created. But at the time, there was nothing illegal about any of this. So he is creating this trust. So this graphic ought to, again, explain the difference between the vertical and the horizontal integration. So this right here, the vertical, this is what Carnegie does, owning everything. They own the raw materials. They own the the places where the iron ore comes from. And then they own all the phases of manufacturing. They have all of the factories and all of that, but then also owning anything to do with shipping and transportation and all of that. So that's vertical. Horizontal is owning all the different manufacturing pieces, all the production and the processing. But that what they have done is, instead of just being me, this little company, I've also got all my competitors over here to entrust their stock and basically give control of their company to me. So that's how they do horizontal integration. Now, as you can probably imagine, having that kind of power, and it is can be quite ruthless, and people like Rockefeller were known for that. For ruthless business practices, for doing what made them money, for doing what made them more powerful and becoming incredibly powerful, and being known to, even if they weren't outright bribing politicians, which sometimes they were, when these companies were so powerful, they pretty much have most, congressmen, leaders, even presidents, the government itself pretty much in their back pocket, even if they're not, outright bribing them. They're going to do what's going to please these big businesses because that was so important to the economy. So cartoons like this one, express concern over that. So you have the Senate here. It says the bosses of the Senate, and here's our senators who are supposed to be the leaders. But who are they listening to? They are listening to these trust bosses, because while Standard Oil was the first of the trust, other businesses are then going to follow suit. And by the time you get to, late 1800s, there's a trust on just about every business you can think of. You can see sugar here, copper, tin, paper bag. I see salt there, leather, tin, mail, banking. All of those have been consolidated into these big trusts. So there's really hardly any small businesses. It is big business. You can imagine that creates a lot of concern, but it's going to be a while before we see, regulation and these trusts broken up, what we'll call trust busting later on. So for right now, it is the day of big business and basically monopolies. Now, as far as these people like Carnegie and Rockefeller and others, Vanderbilt included, I didn't mention JP Morgan with banking, but, ways that people kind of look at them. Sort of two visions of these people. One term that characterizes these kind of business leaders is robber barons. Robber barons is a word used to describe people like Rockefeller, people like Carnegie. But the name robber baron suggests, as you can probably tell, a pretty negative connotation. This suggests that they got rich by stomping on the small companies, by abusing power, by doing things that were not ethical, by doing things that were illegal, by scheming, bribery, paying their workers nothing, just kind of almost just being out for all they could steal, looking out for their own self-interest, acting like kings. You can see this is a cartoon of Rockefeller. See, he's standing on the Standard Oil there. So that's that image of a robber baron. Another view of them, and the view that they would have argued, and that a lot of pro-business people would have argued, is that no, they are more captains of industry. These are people who were smart. These are people who are innovative. These are people that are creating jobs. They are making the economy strong. They are, helping the United States grow and be prosperous and be powerful. So they should be praised for their decisions and not criticized for it, and not be, treated badly for just being good at what they do. So there's that competing vision of how these people ought to be viewed. Now, a few other things that these business people might have believed or might not have believed. These are also kind of two differing views, just like robber barons and captains of industry is kind of two different ways of looking at things. One of these robber barons, captains of industry, Andrew Carnegie, advocated something that he called the gospel of wealth. The gospel of wealth was Carnegie's idea that he advocated for throughout the rest of his life, that people like him that had lots of money should share the wealth. Okay, gospel mean, to share it, to spread it around, that they had an obligation to share their wealth with others, to enhance other people's lives and to enhance the country, enhance their communities with that wealth. Now, that sounds like Carnegie thinks you just go giving out money to people. That's absolutely not what he believed. He wasn't saying give away your money, give away just for charity. He meant give it to charitable organizations and build things, use your money to build things that are going to help other people improve themselves. So things like libraries, for example, was something that Carnegie used his money to build lots of. He gave away billions of dollars of his own fortune. A lot of it went to things like libraries. There are lots of Carnegie libraries throughout the country that were built with his money. Libraries so people could go and study and learn and maybe one day be like Andrew Carnegie and pull themselves up from poverty and be one of the richest people on the planet. Or you may have heard of Carnegie Hall, cultural centers where people could go to experience new things. You have universities like Vanderbilt University. So, those are just some examples. So he didn't mean just hand your money away to people on the street, but build parks, build libraries, build universities, build public facilities that people are going to benefit from and they're going to improve society. So many wealthy people of the time subscribed to that idea and did give away lots of their money. But that's contrary to another belief, and they're not, I wouldn't say these don't have to necessarily be competing beliefs. They're not exactly opposites in that sense, I suppose, but still very different. It's a concept of social Darwinism, which a lot of these people believed in as well. Darwinism reference to Charles Darwin, who you probably remember from science class, the guy that first theorized and argued the theory of evolution. Social Darwinism is sort of some of his theories applied to society, applied to a business world, particularly that principle of survival of the fittest. Think about what you learned in biology. Darwin said the things that are best adapted survive, and those that are weak and not well adapted don't and go extinct. Social Darwinists would have said the same is true of society, that these people like Rockefeller and Carnegie and Vanderbilt and all of them, that they're wealthy because they were better adapted. They were smart, they were innovative, they used the natural tools that they had, and they were successful. And people that were hurt by that and people that were not successful and people that like workers and such, they're in their place because they're not as well adapted. And that's just the breaks. In other words, they're kind of saying, this is just nature. This is just the way things are. It is used to justify the sometimes questionable and perhaps even unethical behavior of some of these business people. So social Darwinists would not have said we should regulate the businesses, shame on people like Rockefeller. They would have said, this is just science, this is biology, and this is why we owe the poor nothing. This is why they don't need any help. We don't need to do anything for them. This is just nature. It's the way it ought to be. So obviously, there's a lot of good and there's a lot of bad that comes with this. There are certainly plenty of groups like the populists and others, even after the populists are long gone, that will argue that something needs to be done to rein in these businesses and stop corruption. And we will look at some of that a little bit later. And also, we will take a look next at some of those people that are not benefiting from some of this, particularly workers, and see how this affects the labor movement and how that continues to struggle to have a lot of success. So we'll talk about that next time.